This week, you'll need to have completed both your introduction and the scavenger hunt. And remember, the scavenger hunt is worth your time because it is worth 10 extra points on your final grade. You'll also need to review the incremental learning outcomes and have read chapters 1, 2, and 13 and completed the worksheets for chapter 1 and 2. You don't need to complete the worksheet for chapter 13 because none of the questions from that worksheet are on the test. After you have completed the worksheets for the first and second chapter, then you can take the practice test. The practice test includes 10 questions, and each question is worth 2 points for 20 points of extra credit. And there are some of the questions on the worksheets on those as well. So, but it gives you an opportunity to kind of experience what the larger test is going to be like. Chapter 1 explains how the text is organized and then covers the basic steps of the research process before you're introduced to each step in subsequent chapters in this text. The first step in the process is to formulate a research question. Next, a researcher conducts a literature review to see what has already been done on the question. Because research is generally cumulative, you need to know what has already been done, mainly by researching peer-reviewed journals, because you want to build on the work of other researchers before you. After your literature review, you formulate the hypothesis, which is a prediction of what you believe exists in the real world. Also, you need to define the meaning of your concepts in your hypothesis, which will help you determine the best way to measure them. This is called operationalizing the concepts. Your next step is to test your hypothesis by accumulating data which you may collect yourself or use data that's already out there. Once your data is collected, then you need to select the appropriate statistical technique to test your hypothesis. After analysis of the data using statistical measures, then you draw your conclusions to determine if the data supports or does not support your hypothesis. In this course, you're going to follow a 14-step process to do research on your own question and submit a final report. I also want to mention that what I have just described is the linear process of research, but research is not always linear. The remainder of chapter 1 will give you a basic introduction to microcase and the data files that are included in the statistical package. Although it may be intimidating at first, completing the worksheets for chapter 1 should demonstrate how easy the program is to use and give you greater confidence in the upcoming chapters. Chapter 13 does not present any new material in at least the first pages in their first pages, and much of this information is already in chapter 1. However, it does cover examples an example of a research question dealing with political tolerance. Read through it to get some flavor as to the expectations for completing a research project. Also, don't bother completing the worksheets, as I said, for chapter 13. Chapter 2 covers some of the basic ideas of measurement, including concepts, variables, and variation. A concept is usually a term that describes the characteristic of a perceived reality. For example, war describes the characteristics of armed conflict between people. We go one step further and define the concept to specify what we mean by the concept itself. For instance, war can be defined as armed conflict between nations or defined as armed conflict between groups of people. Next, we use our concepts to formulate variables to measure our concepts. If we choose to measure the concept war, then we would need to formulate a means to measure it, usually by postulating a survey question and then giving the respondents a series of answers to respond to. And we have to, and as we have mentioned before, how we measure our concepts is referred to as operationalizing the variable. For example, if we ask the question, do you agree or disagree that armed conflict between nations is always justified? You might operationalize it by giving respondents a choice of strongly agree, agree, disagree, and strongly disagree. Each of these choices are called indicators, which are specific observations to measure the concept of war. Variation is what we'll find when we ask the question and get different responses. If everyone answers the same way, then we do not have variation. Explaining variation is what is the goal of the entire research process. Another important topic in research is validity and reliability. Validity is a problem of measuring what we intend to measure. For example, if we try to measure public opinion on the issue of war, we may not achieve consistent results if we use different measurements. For example, if you ask the question, do you agree that America's entry into World War II against Germany and Japan was a justified war, using the same indicators as before, you may find some very different results in your tabulations. You would probably find that most people disagree with the first question, that all war is justified, but agree with the second question, that in this specific instance, war probably was justified. This means that the first question is not a necessary means of consistently measuring the opinion on what is a justified war. We also want our measurement to achieve consistent results, which is a problem with reliability. In your text, the author uses the example of a researcher using the variable Party 2 from the American National Election Study Survey to measure ideology, assuming that all Republicans are conservative, all Democrats are liberal, and all independents are moderate. However, as the example in your text shows, not all Republicans are conservative, not all Democrats are liberal, and not all independents are moderate. Consequently, the variable Party 2 does not reliably measure ideology. One final thing, while you may have a reliable measurement system, it may not be valid. In contrast, a measurement system cannot be valid if it is not reliable. If you have any questions about chapters 1, 2, and 13, or the worksheets in chapter 1 and 2, please use the questions and answers discussion board. So that's it for this week.